I'm Dr. Bill Sodeman, and on this episode of The Perfect Route, we'll be talking about leadership development and starting a learning and development function. All this and more on today's episode of The Perfect Route. Welcome to another edition of The Perfect Route. I am so pleased today to have Stephanie Elad with us. She is the Vice President of Human Resources and Administration for Moss Building and Design. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here today. Well, let's get right to it. Let's start at your beginning. In what first drew you into the world of HR and learning and development, and how has your perspective changed over time?
Sure. Well, I started in HR after a brief stint in marketing after college and after grad school, and realized that wasn't really for me. So moved over into HR, worked up through kind of the recruiting path, hiring people, and then moved into more of a generalist role, which is really where I've been for the majority of my career, kind of that HR business partner. And so as part of that, I participated in a lot of succession planning, talent management, talent development activities as kind of part of that business partner role, representing my, assigned client groups and things like that. So I kind of worked on that in that capacity. And then when I was working for a mortgage company, which was my previous employer, the head of HR saw that I had some skill and experience in the talent realm. And so she ended up creating a role for me to oversee those functions at that organization. And that was probably one of the most favorite jobs that I've ever had. I really enjoyed it. I was full-time working in succession planning, working in talent management, talent development, those kinds of things. So I really enjoyed that role and really being able to dive in kind of full-time into doing those things, because it's a different take on the business when you're doing that full time than when you're doing it, as part of another role and as part of all the other duties that you have as a strategic business partner. But being able to dive in full time was just a lot of fun.
That's great. And I hear you on having to balance different roles and still be involved in learning and development. It's so freeing in a lot of ways to be able to focus in on L&D. And it's great that you had that opportunity.
Yeah, I really did enjoy it. And in my current role, we're, bringing in some of those things as well. This is a much smaller organization that I work for now. And so I definitely have to wear all of the hats.
Mm-hmm.
But one of those hats is the learning and development piece.
Okay. One of the things I'm always interested in is long-term planning and strategic planning. Any thoughts on how your perspective on strategy and learning and development may have changed?
Well, I think the more that I do this work and serve as an HR leader, I think the more I realize how important and valuable it is to do that strategic long-term planning, because you just see the impact and the output of it over time. Kind of as I look back on my career, I realized that those were kind of the most impactful things that I had the chance to touch, was really in that, how do we set up our business for success through the lens of people? And how do we work to make sure that our people are equipped in the best way possible to serve the organization within their current role, but potentially in, roles that have more responsibility down the road. And I think, even now with AI and all of these things coming, that piece of, the touch of the lens of people just becomes even more important. We're thinking that AI is going to replace all of us and everything, but it's really not. There's so many things that, that AI can't capture around nuance and development and dealing with people. It's a complex, dealing with people is very complex. People are very complex. They're all very different. And so, it's being able to have those skills just becomes even more and more critical as I progressed in my career. I see that. And interestingly, my daughter who recently graduated from college is thinking of going into human resources as a field. She's actually been interning for our company, helping as kind of a recruiting assistant and helping in some other areas. She's been doing that for the past couple of years. And it's been, an inspiring experience for her that caused her to, decide that she's strongly exploring a career in HR now that she's graduated. And I remember she said to me just the other day, she said, Mom, recruiting's kind of like a puzzle. It's like a game. You've got this job description and then you've got all these people and you've got to figure out like which one would be the best based on, looking at a resume and having a brief conversation with them, which I just thought was kind of interesting coming from her with such a limited view of HR and such a lack of experience. But she was exactly right. That's exactly what it is. And then you kind of translate that down the road, right, into training and development and those kinds of things. It's the same thing. It's really figuring out like how do we help this person on their journey to be better in the role that they're currently in, or more equipped to take on a different role down the road.
Yeah, the career development piece is critical. What are some of the challenges that you've seen on career development?
Well, it's hard because development is a complex thing and there's a lot of different factors. It's so much based on the requirements of that next level role, but also that person's individual like skill set and strengths and opportunities. And so I think assessment is one of the challenges is do we agree on the assessment of this person's strengths and opportunities? And, I always say it takes two things. It takes will and skill for development. The person has to want to do it. And they might think that they want to do it, right? But then when it gets into doing that work and looking in the mirror and development can be hard, are they willing to kind of show the grit and move through the challenges in order to break through, right? Because you're trying to develop them for something that in most cases they have not done before and they're not currently doing it. So you're trying to get them ready for a future state. So that's a challenge. And then, oftentimes just because folks have that will doesn't necessarily mean that they can get there. And there's a lot of different factors for that. It just might be beyond their capabilities at this time. Mm-hmm. Right. I talk about everybody kind of has a floor and everybody kind of has a ceiling. And those things can evolve over time. My ceiling 15 years ago is not my ceiling now. Sometimes just experience and different, other factors can help raise your ceiling. So sometimes it's just not right at that time. And I've seen that in working with people on development. It's like they just weren't ready at the time we started developing them. So took a pause. And then a few years later, they were more ready and able to kind of break through and get to the other side of it and get that next level role or develop those skills or whatever the case may be. So all of those things are a challenge. You have to make sure your assessment is right for that person and that time. And then you have to be able to build a development plan that actually addresses the issues. And I found in my career in working with leaders that sometimes leaders will want to, develop too many things at the same time. And I try to keep development plans to 2 to 3, maybe 4 at the most, kind of bucketed areas, mm-hmm. and then build some development activities underneath those bucketed areas. Because to try to do more than that is really just too ambitious and usually doesn't lead to success. But if you can keep it focused, develop in those areas, and then you can always add some more later, right? And then, kind of cross off a few. These are checked off. We've made progress here. And then introduce a couple of more things at that time. Because otherwise it's just too much and too overwhelming and doesn't lead to success. So that's usually one of my biggest challenges in leading and working with leaders is making sure that they keep it really tight and really focused on a couple of things so that we can make progress and get to the other side.
Those are some great points. And thanks for sharing your experiences around some of those challenges, Stephanie. I can definitely relate, especially on the career evolution piece. You're so right. It's some of it's timing, and just because we want someone to be at a certain level doesn't mean that they're going to be at that level.
And that's a really good point. And another thing that I've seen over my career, sometimes we want it more for the person than they want it for themselves.
Mm,
And that is usually a recipe to not succeed in that area.
right,
Sometimes we'll see talent in people and we'll see, that they could do it, but maybe they're just not that motivated or they're just not quite there yet. And so we work really hard to develop them and then we get frustrated when the development doesn't happen. And so what I say to leaders is you can't work harder on their development than they're working on it. Because I've seen that and I've seen leaders get extremely frustrated when they're in that place of, I really want this for this person. I know that they can do it, but yet they're not doing the things that I've asked them to do. It's like, well, you can't work harder on their development than they do. That doesn't ever work. But I've seen that over time. And usually when I say that to leaders, something kind of clicks in their mind and they get it and they realize, and then they pull back a little bit and see what happens. And that's usually what I tell them. Like, you don't bring up their development for 2 weeks and see if they bring it up. And if they don't, and they haven't, then maybe now is just not the right time, or maybe this is just not the right person to invest in.
good point. It does need to be top of mind for the person who we've identified for development.
Right. Exactly. And that's critical. And it has to come from them. The desire has to come from them. We can show them the path. We can introduce the concept and see if they, pick up on it and meet us where we're at with it. But the motivation has to come from them or it will not work.
Right.
And that's true when you're dealing with performance issues too. If you're dealing with someone who's not performing, it's the same thing. They have to want to get there as much, if not more, than you want it for them.
Yeah, exactly. Are there some gaps or underdeveloped areas in your current learning programs? And if so, how are you going about addressing those?
Well, we are currently working on sort of organizing our learning programs and kind of building those out at my current employer. So we're really just kind of building it. The learning exists, the training exists, but we're kind of trying to pull it all together and organize it a little bit better. So that's a project that I'm overseeing currently, is making sure kind of all the things that we do in relation to training are organized, written down, and in a repeatable routine. So that's been a good way to kind of go about it. And so we're doing that as we speak, actually. But I think some of the challenges in general are just keeping up with the changes that go on in any industry, especially with AI coming. Again, like I mentioned earlier, it's easy to sort of want AI to do everything for you, and it can do a lot of things, but there's also certain things when you're talking about people development that AI can't do for you. So it's trying to keep up with those changes, though, in terms of how AI is impacting our business. And then I think also just responding to industry trends, responding to the economy. There's so many different factors that affect what a company needs to focus on and look at and how we develop our people. And then I think just really in every organization that I've worked, it's just a challenge keeping the training content and the training process alive and relevant because things are changing so much. So it's like, how do we make sure that our training is keeping up with the changes in the business? And how do we make sure it's relevant? And how do we make sure that people are following the training paths?
And those changes can be pretty fast paced.
Very fast-paced.
Yeah, especially in your industry where the economy has a lot to do with it. I'm sure there are other factors that you can speak to about how both the external and the internal environment affect learning and development.
Definitely. I mean, the company that I work for now it's definitely the smallest company that I've ever worked for, just in terms of employees and things like that, which I'm loving it because it gives me so many opportunities to do so many different things that big companies don't allow you to do. But even just a minor change in the macro factor can impact our business because of that. Right. And so, someone changes the algorithm and we were using that platform to get marketing leads, like that can have a huge impact. Things like change in Feds lowering the interest rate or raising the interest rate can impact our business because our customers do remodeling projects. And so if the interest rates go up, then they have, the amount of the money that they want to borrow to remodel their home, right? That changes the terms of that loan, things like that. And so we also are headquartered in the Northern Virginia area, so right outside of DC. So DC's gone through some layoffs this year. Things like that can impact our business. And again, it's, what might seem to be kind of a small thing, which that's not really a small thing, but even small things can impact us as well as big things. And so we have to constantly be looking and making sure that the things that we're doing are responding to those things that are occurring outside of our control within the organization.
How do the things we've been talking about affect measurement, especially in terms of business outcomes?
Well, it's like I talked about, for all companies, the most important metric is profit, right? Sales, profit, or however they, look at those things. And so that's kind of the bottom line, especially for smaller companies. That's really what we talk about every day is sales and how do we get more sales and how do we ensure that our sales pipeline is healthy and that it is yielding us the number of leads that we need in order to close the deals, to build the projects, to sell. So those are the main factors. So, but every company is obviously a little bit different. But I think bottom line profit is usually sort of where you end up in the end with every employer I've ever worked for. That's what we talk about is, those kinds of things. Stock price, obviously, if it's a public company. But then there's also those other qualitative measures like customer reviews, things like that. We focus on that at my employer, positive customer reviews. We want those because that, for obvious reasons, right? That shows potential clients that we do good work. And that's a big measure of success for us as well as are we getting those customer reviews? Are we getting repeat business? Do customers come back to us later when they want to do another project? Things like that. A lot of those are related to marketing efforts, but in terms of learning and development, it's making sure our employees know that those things are important and including that in our, not just our training, but our culture to make sure they understand that what we would like them to do matters. And then also rewarding for that, right? It's what you measure and what you reward for should be the same. So making sure that, when we meet our goals, that the employees are rewarded for that.
Yeah, and employees do need to see that connection regularly. If not hourly, then every day. Just to,
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely regularly. You want to make sure that we're tying it back, and so we do that here and in every organization I've worked for. There's some way to do that, whether it's, regular meetings or, company events or emails, tracking progress, things like that. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that, but you want to make sure that you're constantly talking about it because, if we're talking about, for example, Google reviews, and then we stop talking about it for 6 months, right? Then those are probably going to go down because everyone's busy. They're doing their job. They're not always thinking about it. You got to remind employees that, these things are important. And so they keep it top of mind because what's top of mind is what happens, right? And so it's very easy in the day-to-day to sometimes let some of these other things fall by the wayside if you don't keep talking about them and make sure employees know that they're important. That's true for all of us. So,
excellent point. And both HR and learning and development have so much to do with reinforcing those connections in employees' minds and in their mindset. There's the culture piece, of course. There's strategy. So many different things fall into this. We were talking about leadership development earlier. Are there specific leadership capabilities that that Moss is trying to build out right now, and how are you supporting that effort?
Well, there always are leadership capabilities that are, kind of just standard across all industries. I think time management's always one. It's not necessarily leadership skills, but leaders need to be able to do that. And in a busy, fast-paced environment, again, if you're not really good at those things like communication, time management, how to motivate and inspire others, and also coach them to meet their performance goals. I think without those things, it's hard to lead, right? And it's hard to be successful in a leadership capacity if you don't have those things. So we've been talking a little bit about some of those things lately, which is true pretty much for every organization I've ever worked. We talk about those things like how do you motivate and inspire people? How do you make sure they're meeting their goals? How do you manage your own days and weeks and months in order to get through those things? How do you communicate most effectively so that people understand what's expected and what it is you're asking and things like that? So I think those are kind of standard things that I've seen across all organizations that we have worked on. And then, you have other concepts like situational leadership, and you want to make sure that people understand that how you manage employee A might not be the same as how you manage employee B, and how you manage employees who are performing or exceeding expectations is going to look different than how you manage newer employees or employees who are maybe struggling a little bit in their role for some reason. So those are the kinds of things that I think we have to make sure our leaders understand, but that you coach them on regularly. We have leaders, and all organizations have leaders at different levels in terms of experience being a leader. And so what I found is that all leaders need some coaching in some of these areas, specifically around how to coach and develop their employees and motivate their teams, because they didn't, a lot of times they don't get those skills and then they get promoted, right? The best salesperson becomes the sales manager. Doesn't mean they know how to manage salespeople, just means they were a great salesperson. So sometimes those leaders have those experiences, but sometimes they don't. And so it's really helping them work through the situations that come up, and then they learn. And then when the next situation comes up, it usually is slightly different, but they've learned some things. And so they can sort of take the principles that they've learned, try to apply it to this new situation. But that's where I think the ongoing coaching and development is so impactful, because I've been doing this 25 years and there really aren't two situations that are the same when you're talking about developing people. They're all very different. They all have some nuance. They all have something that makes them unique. Again, based on the person, based on the situation, based on the business. There's so many different things that can impact that. So being able to discuss that as a team or with your HR leader or with your manager and kind of like figure some of this stuff out. And when I work with leaders, kind of the higher they are in the organization, the more time they spend kind of coaching their leaders that report to them in terms of some of these people development, people performance issues, because that's really where, it comes up and where it becomes so critical is kind of that day to day, like, what is going on with this particular situation and how can we make it, how can we help improve it? And so those are the conversations that I enjoy having the most. It's kind of like my daughter said, it's kind of like a game. It's trying to figure out, okay, we have this person, we have this situation. How can we help this person be more effective? How can we help this person improve their performance? What is going on with them? What is going on, outside of them? What is going on within the organization? How do we put all that together and help them get clarity on kind of what next steps are? How do we first assess what it is, figure it out, and then how do we help communicate it to them in an effective way so that we can get to the other side of whatever it is we're trying to work through.
Yeah, and as you were describing your thoughts on leadership capabilities, continuous improvement just popped into my head. And
Yes. Because again, kind of to what we were talking about previously, the business is changing, the landscape is changing. So it has to be continuous improvement. I mean, even if you have an organization where things are pretty stable, which I've never really worked in an organization where things were that stable, it's constant change, right? But even if you could have that, right, you still have new people joining the organization, you still have people dealing with different things outside of work that might be impacting them at work. You still have different things that go on that you have to be on that continuous improvement cycle for all of us, even the highest level of leadership. In fact, the CEOs that I've worked with, the senior level leaders, are usually the ones who are the most focused on continuous improvement. That's probably how they got to where they are, is because they're sort of self-directed in that area, and they will do that without even being prompted to do so. They just do that. They read leadership books, they attend seminars, they have a mentor or a coach that is constantly, that they're working with, and that they're constantly looking at, how can I do this better? How can I be a better leader? How can, the organization that I run perform at a higher level? They're looking at those things constantly.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point about senior leadership, in comparison to the middle and the first rank supervisors. Continuous improvement, sometimes I think it's like a muscle that you have to develop.
Definitely. And at our organization, our CEO, he's very focused on that. He wants all of us to have personal goals, professional goals. He wants to know what they are. He wants to know how he can help us with those things. And, he's constantly looking at, like, how can I help my team perform at a higher level? And so that, that's fun to work with too, as an HR professional, whose passion is really talent, because then we can explore different things, we can try different things, we can work with people. We're talking about, development and training at every weekly leadership meeting. We're focused on, where are we at with this person? What does our team need to know? What exercises can we do with them to help the leaders be more effective? All those things, for me, as a practitioner of this, make it exciting and engaging and kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of engagement, that brings up a wealth of things, including relevancy. How do you make sure that the learning within Moss is relevant across all these different departments and teams and locations that you've got?
Well, it's something that we are constantly looking at, keeping training top of mind, keeping learning top of mind at regular intervals, talking about it. I just went through an exercise where I asked the folks that we've hired, because I've hired quite a few folks in the past 12 months. And so I just went back to them and I said, can you give me some feedback about your onboarding and training when you came? And then took that information to, kind of strengthen what it is that we're already doing, which is kind of what led to the project that I referenced earlier, about really just taking a look at everything and upgrading our training efforts. But it was really through those conversations with those people where those new hires shared with me, what they thought worked well and what they thought could be improved. They gave some ideas from previous organizations that they had worked for before us, that had worked well. And so I kind of synthesized all that information, and that's what we're using to inform kind of where we go next with our process. So I think you just have to keep looking at it. It's just like, your recognition and all of those things, making sure, but someone has to own it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's typically sits in the HR world, right?
Right.
So someone has to own it and be responsible for it. That's step one. But then I think, on the flip side of that is that the entire leadership team has to buy into the process and help co-create it. And so they have to understand that it's important. And then they have to be willing to engage in the process. I don't know, how the people at where I work at Moss do their jobs. I don't know how to be a project designer or to sell remodeling projects. I don't know how to do that. But there are people here that know how and that can train other people how and that are training other people how. So it's asking them, like, hey, take a look at this. What are we missing? What are the gaps? How can this be better? Because they're the functional experts. So you definitely have to engage them. And I've worked for larger organizations that would kind of separate their training function, sort of more kind of that leadership cultural piece and then operational training. They would have kind of two different divisions of training that would sort of focus on those things separately, and then they would sort of merge together at some point in the organization. But in a smaller organization where we're a 2-person HR shop here, it's myself and then there's an HR coordinator and then we have a part-time intern. We don't have the luxury of doing that, so I've got to figure out how to get the operational pieces with and merge it together with everything, because that's key. And I can't do that. I can't train someone on how to build a remodeling project. I don't know. But what I can do is drive the process, right? And marry it with the cultural training that we want to do, and the onboarding and things like that, and make sure that, we have timelines and we have specific learning that needs to happen and goals. I can do all of those things, but I need some help on the, specific pieces that need to be learned and what success looks like and how we know when someone is officially trained versus learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And those are definitely two different things because, I'm a big believer in everboarding. Onboarding never really ends.
I like that. I'm gonna use that.
Okay. Yeah, I actually nicked that from an interesting book that I read a while back. But everboarding, it plays into continuous improvement. It plays into some of the topics we discussed today, along with career development, people's readiness to step into roles, and their willingness to engage and learn from the various offerings that HR and learning and development have set up for them. Any final thoughts for our listeners, Stephanie?
Well, I think we covered most of it. I think that it's critical that talent development and talent management is part of every organization, as well as learning, of course. I do think that most organizations see the value in learning and training. I think the talent piece sometimes is done not necessarily in a systematic, organized way, and so it can kind of lose its way. I do think that that's a little bit of a harder sell in some organizations, not the ones I've had the benefit to work for. Quite honestly, they've seen that, and it's already been built in. But I know, in talking with other HR practitioners that I know across the country, a lot of times that's the one thing that sort of gets brushed by the wayside, just because it does take time and it does take follow-up and it does take a plan, and it's got to be on the calendar at regular intervals to review your talent and to follow up on the development plans that are created and things like that. So I do think that's one of the most important things that HR practitioners can do, is make sure that that is on the calendar and it is part of the plan. Sometimes, like I said, I have known that that's a harder sell. But I think it's probably one of the most critical things. But it's easy to get lost by the wayside when you're hiring people and when you're onboarding and training and all the other things that you have to do. This one can sometimes fall off the radar. And I think that really the key to any business's success is the ability to do this well. And the organizations that I've had, I've been fortunate to work for, have understood this, which kind of planted the seeds for me early on that this is important and you have to schedule it and you have to work on it and you have to follow up on it and you have to ensure that it happens.
Mm-hmm. Great points. Great points. Well, I wanted to thank you, Stephanie, for joining us today on The Perfect Route. And I also wanted to thank our listeners and viewers for tuning into the podcast. And we will see you on another piece of our journey on The Perfect Route.